live in a small suburb in Oregon, one of those very quiet ones with residential streets and low houses, where almost everyone recognizes each other by sight. At the time, my son was 6 years old and attended an elementary school about a 15-minute walk from our house. I walked him there almost every day because I liked having that time together before school. It was winter. It had snowed heavily that week and the sidewalks were narrow with piles of snow on both sides. The air was always very cold in the morning, the kind that burns your nose, and everything felt overly silent. The school had a tall metal fence around the yard, and the street we walked along ran parallel to that fence for a good stretch. Normally, there were just other parents, children, and a few cars passing slowly. Nothing out of the ordinary. The first day I noticed him, I thought it was a coincidence. I was walking with my son holding his hand with my thick glove when I noticed a man walking on the other side of the fence, inside the schoolyard. He was well bundled up, wearing a dark coat and a low-pulled beanie, and he walked at the same pace as we did. When I slowed down because of the ice, he slowed down too. When I sped up a little, he matched it. It didn't look like he was heading anywhere specific, just walking parallel to the fence. I thought he might be a school employee, maybe someone responsible for maintenance, and I tried not to give it importance. Even so, I remember feeling a slight discomfort, like when you realize someone is watching you but pretend it's nothing. On the second day, I paid closer attention. The snow had hardened overnight and the sound of our steps was a constant crunch on the ground. My son talked about a simple test he would have that day, and I answered him, but part of my mind was focused on the man. He was there again, on the other side of the fence, wearing practically the same clothes. He walked at the same pace, neither fast nor slow, always keeping the same distance. I tried looking directly at him a few times, but he never looked at me. His gaze seemed fixed straight ahead, as if he were focused only on walking. That bothered me more than if he had stared at me. I started thinking that maybe he was someone who lived nearby and used the empty yard to walk early in the morning, but even so, it felt strange. On the third day, the cold was even more intense and there was almost no one on the street. The school was still closed when we got near the gate, and only a few cars passed in the distance. The silence was broken only by the wind and the distant metallic sound of the fence when he passed too close to it. That day, I noticed that he never got closer to the fence nor farther away. It was always the exact same distance, as if he were measuring his steps. My son even asked who the man on the other side was, and I felt a knot in my stomach. I answered that he must be someone working there, but my voice came out faster than usual. I started feeling that constant tension in my body, stiff shoulders, shorter breathing, trying to appear calm for him. On the fourth day, I woke up already thinking about him, which annoyed me with myself. I tried to convince myself that I was exaggerating, that it was just someone coinciding with our schedule. Even so, I left the house more alert. The sky was gray and heavy, and the snow reflected a weak light that made everything look colorless. When we got close to the school, I saw him again. Same posture, same pace, same distance. This time I stopped walking for a few seconds, pretending to adjust my son's backpack. He stopped too, on the other side of the fence, in exactly the same position. He didn't look at me, didn't check a phone, didn't do anything. He just stood there waiting. That gave me a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. From that point on, I started varying our schedule on purpose. I left home a little earlier one day, a little later the next. Even so, he appeared. Not exactly in the same spot, but always walking parallel when I reached that stretch of fence. I began to notice details. The way he stepped, always firm, never slipping, as if he already knew the ground well. The fact that he didn't leave visible marks in the softer snow, and how he never seemed tired. I tried to rationalize, telling myself that all of this could have an explanation, but my body reacted before my mind did. My hands sweated inside my gloves, and I felt a constant urgency to hurry up until we reached the school gate. The next morning, something felt different right away. It was darker than usual because I had left a bit earlier trying to avoid activity. The streetlights were still on, reflecting on the dirty snow along the sidewalks. When we got close to the school, I didn't see anyone on the other side of the fence. That should have relieved me, but it had the opposite effect. My stomach sank, like when you realize something that has always been there has suddenly disappeared. I kept walking slowly, looking at the empty yard, trying to spot any movement. The silence felt heavier, and even my son went quiet, holding my hand more tightly. I kept repeating in my head that it was just coincidence, that maybe he hadn't come that day. That's when I saw him. He was standing still, not walking, much farther ahead inside the schoolyard. Not near the fence like before, but close to the side door I always used to drop off my son. He was completely motionless, facing the door, as if he were waiting for something to happen there. When I realized this, my body reacted before my thoughts did. I felt my heart race and a strange pressure in my chest. He didn't turn when he heard our steps, didn't move when we got closer. His posture was rigid, almost rehearsed. I tried to say something to my son, anything normal, but my voice broke halfway through the sentence. I stopped walking reflexively, and my son almost bumped into me. I stood there, frozen, looking at that man inside the empty yard. The fence, which had previously seemed like a clear barrier between us, no longer meant anything. He was on the same side of the school as we were, separated by just a few meters of packed snow and concrete. The door he was staring at was exactly the one I always used because it was closer to our route. It wasn't the main entrance, nor the one other parents used more often. That made it clear, at least to me, that it wasn't a coincidence. I felt an almost physical need to change direction, but my legs took a moment to respond. Without saying anything, I grabbed my son's hand harder than I should have and started walking toward the main entrance, which was farther away. Each step felt slow and heavy, and I constantly felt like he would move at any second. But he didn't move. He didn't turn his head, didn't take a step, didn't react to our change of path. That somehow was worse. When we got near other parents, I felt a small wave of relief, as if simply not being alone was a form of protection. I left my son with his teacher without explaining anything, trying to smile, but my hands were still shaking. After dropping him off, I stood for a few seconds in the entrance hallway, pretending to look for something in my bag. I wanted to be sure the man was still where I had seen him. When I finally worked up the courage to look through the glass door, the yard looked empty again. I didn't see the dark coat or the beanie. That didn't reassure me. On the contrary, I felt a strange emptiness, as if I had lost sight of something important not to lose. I left the school quickly with the sensation of being watched from behind. I looked to the sides behind me at the street, but I didn't see anyone who looked out of place. Even so, my body stayed on alert, and I only relaxed a little when I got home and locked the door. I spent the rest of the morning restless, replaying every detail of the previous days. I thought about calling the school, about mentioning it to someone, but I felt a bit ridiculous trying to explain something so hard to prove. That afternoon, when I went to pick up my son, I made a point of going with another mother from the street. We didn't see the man at that time, nor in the days that followed. He simply stopped appearing. To this day, when I walk past that stretch of fence in the winter, I feel the same knot in my stomach. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but the certainty that he knew exactly which path I took and which door I stopped at still unsettles me. A few weeks later, I worked up the courage to casually mention it to the school secretary. I asked if there was any employee who usually walked around the yard very early, before opening time. She thought for a few seconds and said no, that the school only had people arriving closer to when the gates opened. I asked about a guard, someone from maintenance. She shook her head and said not at that hour. I didn't push it. The conversation ended there, but I left with a heavy feeling, as if I had confirmed something I would have preferred not to be sure about. That night, it took me a long time to fall asleep, hearing every noise outside as if it were a step in the snow. Over time, the routine returned to normal, but I never used the side door again. Even when no one was around, I would go the long way and enter through the main entrance. I also stopped going at the same time every day. It may sound exaggerated, but it stayed with me. There was no chase, no confrontation, nothing really happened. And maybe that's what bothers me most. The idea that someone was there, watching, learning my habits, and then simply decided to leave. To this day, I don't know whether he gave up on something or if he got what he wanted without me realizing it. After that, I started noticing small things I used to ignore. Footprints near the fence that didn't match the entry times. The side gate sometimes unlocked when I was sure it had been closed. The constant feeling of being watched when I walked alone on that block. I never saw the man again, but I never stopped thinking about him. Sometimes I caught myself looking into the yard even when I didn't need to, just to confirm it was empty. My son eventually forgot about it, but I didn't. That image of him standing there looking at the right door stayed with me in a way that's hard to explain. Today, years later, I still live in the same town, but I no longer take that route. Whenever it snows and I see someone walking on the other side of a fence, my body reacts before my mind does. I don't know if that man had any real intention, or if he was just someone too strange to ignore. What I do know is that he wasn't there by chance, and that for a few days someone knew my routine better than I would have liked. Nothing explicit happened, no one got hurt, but the feeling that something could have happened never went away. That's why I decided to write this here. Story 2. I moved into this house in Idaho right after my divorce, trying to start over on my own. It was a simple single-story house far from downtown, with the woods starting practically at the back of the yard. I chose the place precisely because it seemed almost too quiet, nearly isolated, and because the rent fit my budget at that stage. I worked from home, so I spent many days without going out, especially at night. The house creaked a lot in the cold, and the silence was constant, broken only by the wind in the trees and some animal passing far away. At first, that felt peaceful to me. I even liked the feeling of finally being alone, organizing my routine my own way. The neighbor appeared for the first time on an ordinary afternoon, when I was unloading groceries from the car. He came up from the side of the fence, as if he had already been there for a while, and offered to help. He spoke softly with an overly polite tone and said he lived 2 houses down from mine. I thought it was normal. In small towns, people usually introduce themselves. He commented that the area got very quiet at night, especially for someone who lived alone. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I just agreed and thanked him. But later I realized that he only showed up on specific days, always on days when my phone didn't ring, when no one came to visit me, when I was clearly alone. I started noticing this because it wasn't constant. There were weeks when I didn't see him at all, and others when he appeared 2 or 3 times, always at similar times, late afternoon or early evening. It was never in the morning, never when I was leaving the house. He always showed up when I was already inside with the lights on, as if he knew I hadn't gone anywhere. Sometimes he knocked on the side gate. Sometimes he called me by my name, even though I didn't remember ever telling him my full name. He asked if I needed help with something simple, if everything was okay, if I didn't feel unsafe there alone. I answered politely, but I felt a discomfort that was hard to explain. One night he commented again about the silence. He said that the area got too quiet after dark, and that you could hear everything when there was no one else around. He said this while looking around the house, not at me. I laughed nervously and said I was already used to it. When I went inside and closed the door, I realized my heart was racing for no clear reason. I kept thinking about how he knew exactly when I was alone. I didn't have a fixed routine of visitors, and I didn't talk about my life with anyone there. Even so, I started locking the door earlier and leaving some lights on at night, just to feel less exposed. A few days later, I woke up early to a strange noise outside the bedroom. It wasn't loud, but it was rhythmic, like careful footsteps on wet ground. I stayed still in bed, listening, trying to understand if it was just some animal. When I worked up the courage to look out the window, I saw recent marks on the ground very close to the bedroom wall. The dirt was marked in a different way, deeper, as if someone had stood there for a few seconds. There were no footprints leading into the woods, just those marks close to the house. The morning air was icy, and I had the feeling that it had happened shortly before I woke up. That afternoon, the neighbor showed up again. This time he asked if I had slept well and commented that he had seen my light on until late. That made me tense. I didn't remember leaving any exterior light on. I looked at the side door of the house after he left and realized it was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it the night before. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at the lock, trying to remember if it had been my mistake. When I asked him later directly if he had been near the house, he smiled briefly and said he never came close, that he respected my privacy. After that, I started checking doors and windows several times before going to sleep. The silence of the house, which had calmed me before, turned into something heavy, almost physical. At night, I lay in bed trying to hear any different sound. A branch breaking, footsteps on the dirt, the wind hitting something it shouldn't. On more than one night, I woke up with the feeling that someone had just moved away from the house. That sudden silence that comes after a noise stops. When I got up to look, I saw nothing but the dark yard and the line of trees standing still, unmoving. Even so, I had trouble going back to sleep, my whole body on alert. A few days later, I noticed that the marks near the bedroom had appeared again, almost in the same spot. They weren't exactly clear footprints, but recent depressions, as if someone had stood there, too close to the window. The curtain was slightly out of place, a tiny thing, but I didn't remember touching it. That same day, the neighbor showed up in the late afternoon and commented that I looked tired, asking if I was sleeping poorly. That gave me a knot in my stomach. I answered curtly and ended the conversation quickly. When I went back inside, I locked everything and sat on the couch doing nothing for several minutes, trying to decide if I was exaggerating or if I had a real reason to be afraid. That night, I decided not to turn off all the lights. I left the kitchen and hallway lights on, even knowing it wouldn't help much. The wind was stronger, hitting the trees in the woods behind the house, and the sound came in muffled through the walls. At some point near dawn, I woke up to a soft, metallic click coming from the side of the house. It wasn't loud enough to sound like a knock, but it was too clear to be just the house settling. I lay there not moving, counting the seconds, waiting to hear something else. Nothing happened. Even so, my entire body was tense, as if I were holding my breath without realizing it. When morning came, I went straight to the side door. It was closed, but not locked. The latch was exactly the way it is when someone pushes it without turning the key. I went outside and saw new marks in the dirt, closer to the door than before. The ground was still damp with morning dew, and it was clear they were recent. I went back inside with my hands shaking and called a friend, just to hear another voice. Later, when the neighbor showed up as if nothing had happened, I confronted him again, saying that someone had been near my house during the night. He denied it immediately, said I must be imagining things, that the area had a lot of animals. The overly calm way he said this scared me more than if he had gotten angry. After that, I couldn't stay there alone at night anymore. I started sleeping with my phone in my hand, left the television on very low just to break the silence, and any noise made me get out of bed. I avoided going into the yard and kept the curtains closed all the time. The neighbor appeared one more time, knocking on the gate early in the evening, saying he had noticed I seemed more tense and asking if everything was okay. I answered from inside the house without opening and said I was having visitors. He stayed silent for a few seconds before leaving. That pause, without an immediate response, gave me the feeling that he was listening, trying to confirm something. At the end of that week, I packed a backpack and went to stay a few days at a friend's house. I didn't tell her everything, just said I wasn't feeling good there. When I came back to get some things, the house was exactly as I had left it, but the side door was unlocked again. Nothing had been moved, nothing was missing. Even so, that was enough. I notified the landlord, who changed the locks, and I started looking for another place to live. I never proved it was the neighbor. I never saw him inside my house. But to this day, what scares me the most are not the marks in the dirt or the open door. It's the fact that someone knew exactly when I was alone and acted as if that were normal. I ended up moving out of that house a few months later. I didn't say anything to the neighbor when I left, didn't say goodbye. Since then, whenever I'm alone somewhere very quiet, that feeling comes back, as if the silence could reveal more than any noise. I never had a concrete explanation for what happened, and maybe I never will, but I learned to trust the discomfort before any proof. Sometimes fear doesn't come from what someone does, but from how much that person seems to know without ever needing to ask. Story 3. I rented that cabin in Montana to spend a weekend alone, just to fish and clear my head. I was coming out of an exhausting phase at work and wanted to stay away from people, cell service, and noise. The cabin was far from everything, in the middle of an open wooded area near a narrow river. It was simple, made of old wood with small windows and a short porch in front. I arrived in the late afternoon with the sky already starting to get dark, and the first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was that silence that feels too big, like it takes up space. It was cold. There was snow piled up around, and the ground creaked under my boots. I spent the beginning of the night in a normal way. I made something simple to eat, organized my things, and sat for a while near the heater. The wind hit the cabin lightly, causing some creaks that I attributed to the temperature dropping. Outside, the porch light illuminated only a small circle of snow. There were no other lights nearby, no visible houses, nothing. I felt isolated, but still comfortable with that. Around 10 at night, I turned off almost all the lights and went to bed. The heater made a constant noise, and for a while that was enough to help me relax. It took me a bit to fall asleep, more because of the different environment than anything else. At some point during the night, I woke up to a sound that didn't match the wind or the wood of the house. It was a low, rhythmic crunch like slow footsteps in the snow. I stayed lying there, not moving, trying to understand where it was coming from. The sound stopped for a few seconds and then came back, always outside. I thought it could be a large animal, maybe an elk or something like that, but the steps were too regular. There wasn't that confused dragging that animals usually make. They sounded like calculated steps, like someone walking without any hurry around the cabin. After a few minutes, I heard something that made me completely alert. A short, dry sound, followed by a slight rattle, very close to the wall. It was the clear sound of someone touching the window, as if testing whether it was unlocked. Right after that, the same sound repeated at another window, farther away, on the other side of the cabin. It wasn't a loud knock nor an attempt to break in. It was careful, almost professional. I stayed frozen in bed, my heart racing, counting how many windows I remembered the cabin had. The sound moved from one to another, always with the same intensity, with no rush at all. At that point, I was already sitting on the bed, holding my phone with the screen off. There was no signal there, but it was a reflex. I tried to hear someone's breathing outside, any sign beyond the footsteps and the tapping on the windows. The heater now seemed too loud, and I thought about turning it off, but I was afraid of making any noise that might give away that I was awake. The sound continued, window by window, making a full circle around the cabin. When it came close to the bedroom wall, I felt the cold run up my spine, as if the person were just a few feet away from me, separated only by the thin wood. After a few minutes that felt much longer, everything stopped suddenly. It wasn't a gradual retreat, it simply ceased. I waited to hear footsteps moving away, but I heard nothing. It was that silence that made me get up. I walked slowly to the living room and turned on the external lights on the porch and at the back of the cabin. The light illuminated the snow around, but there was no one there. No moving shadows, no sound. I waited a few seconds, my hand shaking on the switch, but nothing happened. Even so, I couldn't go back to sleep. I stayed sitting on the couch until it started to get light. When morning came, I went out of the cabin still tense, as if I hadn't rested at all. The morning air was biting cold, and the snow looked harder, marked by long shadows. That's when I saw the marks. Boot prints, well-defined, went all the way around the entire cabin. They weren't messy marks, nor from someone passing by casually. They formed a clear, repeated path, as if the person had walked around several times, observing each side. The prints came close to every window and the door, stopped for a few seconds, and then continued on. You could see where someone had stood still, with weight distributed, as if evaluating. I walked slowly around the cabin, following the marks, trying to understand the pattern. In some places, the prints overlapped, indicating that the person had passed there more than once. There were no tracks leading toward the river or toward the road. It was as if someone had come straight to the cabin, circled the place for a while, and then disappeared into the woods without leaving a clear path. The cold wind hit my face and I felt a metallic taste in my mouth from nerves. At that moment, it was clear that what I had heard was not my imagination. Someone had been there, awake, calm, testing limits while I was inside. I went back into the cabin and locked the door, even knowing that didn't change much in daylight. I checked all the windows one by one. None were broken, none seemed forced, but 2 were unlocked, exactly the ones I remembered hearing being tested closer to the bedroom. That made me feel immediately sick. I was sure I had locked everything before going to sleep. It was a habit of mine. I stood in the middle of the living room trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to leave right away, but another part still tried to rationalize, saying it might have been someone curious, a local resident. Even so, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I gathered my things without rushing, but also without wasting time. Every sound outside made me stop and listen, expecting footsteps again. Before leaving, I took one more walk around the cabin, as if trying to better understand what had happened there during the night. The marks were still all there, intact, like a silent record. There was no sign of forced entry, which made everything even stranger. Whoever it was didn't seem to be in a hurry, nor desperate. It felt like someone studying the place, testing possibilities. I got into the car and left without looking back. I drove for quite a while before I was able to relax my hands on the steering wheel a little. The road was empty, surrounded only by snow-covered trees, and every stretch of woods made me look in the rearview mirror by instinct. I kept replaying the entire night in my head, trying to identify some detail I might have ignored. There was no shouting, no clear attempt at invasion, nothing that seemed urgent. That was what bothered me the most. Whoever was there didn't seem scared, nor indecisive. The person had enough time to calmly test each window, as if they knew exactly what they were doing and had simply decided not to go inside for some reason. When I reached an area with signal, I thought about calling the cabin owner, but I ended up not doing it. I didn't even know how to explain it without sounding paranoid. What would I say? That someone walked around the cabin all night and then left? In the end, I just sent a short message saying I was leaving earlier than planned. To this day, when I think about that night, what gives me the chills the most aren't the footsteps or the marks in the snow. It's the idea that someone was there so close, calmly evaluating while I lay in bed pretending to sleep. After that weekend, I never rented isolated places like that again. I told the story to very few people, always in a summarized way, because I realized that when I explained the details it sounded exaggerated even to myself. But I know what I heard. I know the difference between an animal walking in the snow and someone carefully testing windows. I know the weight of those steps, the exact pause at each spot, the absolute silence when the lights came on. Nothing about that night was rushed or impulsive. That's what still bothers me the most today. Sometimes I still think about what would have happened if I hadn't turned on the lights or if I had slept too deeply to hear anything. Maybe nothing. Maybe something. The fact is that someone studied that cabin long enough to know every window and every weak point, and decided to leave without leaving anything behind except marks in the snow. I never found out who it was, and I never had a clear explanation, but that feeling of being evaluated, while I thought I was completely alone, is something that didn't stay in that cabin. Story 4. I was in college at the time and worked part-time at night to pay my expenses. I lived in a small town in Kansas, the kind where almost everything closes early and the streets are empty after 9. On that particular day, the cold was much more intense than usual, and snow had started to fall lightly but steadily. I left work around 10 at night and decided to walk home because the route was short and I didn't have a car. I was wearing a thick coat, a scarf pulled up to my nose, and gloves, but even so, the wind cut right through everything. The streetlights reflected on the wet snow, making the ground slippery and the atmosphere far too quiet. I walked fast, more to keep warm than out of fear, with my backpack heavy on my back and my thoughts elsewhere. Hardly any cars passed by at that hour. That's when a dark sedan slowed down beside me. The passenger window rolled down and a man, apparently in his 40s, called out to me in a calm voice. He asked for directions to a nearby street, saying he was a bit lost. I stopped a few steps away from the car, keeping my distance, and explained the route as clearly as I could. He thanked me, gave a quick smile, and drove off. At the time, I didn't think anything of it. In a small town, that happens. I kept walking, trying not to focus on the cold cutting into my legs. I walked for a few more minutes, already thinking about getting home, when I heard a car approaching again from behind. The sound of tires on snow was low, but recognizable. When I glanced over, I felt my stomach tighten. It was the same dark sedan. It slowed down again and stopped almost in the same spot, as if this were part of a routine. The window rolled down and the same man looked at me with the same neutral expression. He asked for directions to the same street, using practically the same words. For a few seconds, I thought he might be joking or trying to start a conversation, but his manner was far too serious for that. I answered again, repeating exactly what I had said before, only faster this time. While I spoke, I noticed that he didn't seem to be really listening. He was looking at me, not at the street I was pointing to. When I finished, He thanked me in the same way and drove off, without saying anything else. I stood there for a moment, feeling the cold creep up my legs, trying to understand whether I was overreacting. Maybe he really hadn't understood the first time. Maybe he was nervous. Even so, something about that mechanical repetition put me on alert. I started walking faster, feeling my heart beating harder than before. After that, I found myself looking back more often, something I didn't usually do. The snow began to fall a little heavier, and the street felt even emptier. I could hear my own muffled footsteps and the distant sound of an engine idling somewhere behind me, but I couldn't see the car at that moment. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, that I was tired and too cold. Even so, I tightened my grip on my backpack strap and kept up the faster pace. Each block felt longer than usual, and I felt that strange pressure in my chest, like when something is wrong but you can't explain what it is. When I got near a small convenience store that stayed open later, I saw the sedan again. It was parked on the other side of the street, with the engine running. It wasn't passing by, and it wasn't casually parked. It was there, as if it had arrived before me. My instinct was to go into the store immediately. I pushed the door open firmly, feeling the warm air hit my face, and went straight down one of the aisles, pretending to look at something. Through the display window, I saw the car pull in and park right in front. The man didn't get out, he just sat there looking into the store as if he were waiting for something. I stayed inside for a few minutes trying to look calm, but my hands trembled slightly when I picked up a random item from the shelf. The cashier looked at me and asked if I needed help, and I said no, but my voice sounded strange. I looked again through the window and the car was still there, stopped in the same way. The man wasn't on his phone, wasn't talking to anyone, wasn't doing anything except looking in my direction. It felt like time had slowed down. Every second felt far too long, and I kept thinking about whether he would come into the store or if he was just waiting for me to leave. After a while that felt longer than it really was, the car slowly pulled out of the parking lot. I waited a few more minutes before paying and leaving. When I finally stepped back onto the sidewalk, I felt the cold hit hard, but the relief didn't come the way I expected. I looked both ways down the street before starting to walk, with the constant feeling that he might appear again. The walk home never felt so long, and I couldn't relax even when I reached my door. When I got home, I locked the door faster than usual and leaned my back against it for a few seconds, just trying to regulate my breathing. The house was silent and cold. Since I had been out all day, I dropped my backpack on the couch and went straight to the front window, pulling the curtain aside just a little. The street was empty, covered in snow, lit by a street light that flickered faintly. No cars in sight. Even so, I couldn't feel safe. I had the sense that it wasn't over yet, as if something were left unresolved. A few minutes later, while I was heating water in the kitchen, I heard a car passing slowly. The sound made me freeze instantly. I went to the side window carefully, trying not to make noise, and saw a dark sedan moving slowly down the street, almost crawling. I'm not absolutely sure it was the same car, but the shape and color were very similar. It didn't stop this time, just kept going, but that was enough to make my stomach turn. I closed all the curtains and turned off the front lights, leaving only the kitchen light on. I spent the rest of the night awake, sitting on the couch with the television on just to have some noise. Every sound from the street made me look toward the door or the windows. At times I was sure I heard a car slowing down outside, but when I gathered the courage to look, I saw nothing. I tried to rationalize, telling myself that the man had just been lost, that the town was small and that similar cars drove around all the time. Even so, the image of him asking for the same directions with the same tone kept coming back to my mind. It wasn't the request itself that scared me. It was the way the answer seemed not to matter. The next day I told a classmate what had happened, trying to keep it brief so I wouldn't sound exaggerated. She told me to ignore it, that it was probably just someone confused or trying to start a conversation. Maybe it was. But to this day, whenever someone pulls up in a car to talk to me at night, my body freezes before I even think. I don't know what that man wanted, or why he came back as if he had never heard me. I only know that on that cold night in Kansas, the feeling of being watched didn't stay outside the store. Sometime later, I realized that that episode had changed small things in my behavior without me noticing. I started avoiding walking home alone at night whenever I could, called someone during the walk, and went into any open place if I felt something was off. I never saw that car again, never had confirmation that it was the same person passing by my street, and nothing concrete happened after that night. Still, the impact remained. Sometimes what scares you most isn't a clear threat, but someone who acts as if you hadn't said anything at all, as if your presence were just a detail. That night ended without a confrontation, without an explanation, and maybe that's why it still bothers me so much. Story 5. My wife and I lived in a secluded house in rural Minnesota, surrounded by trees and with very few neighbors nearby. At that time, we were already used to harsh winters, but that night, the snowstorm felt different. The wind slammed hard against the walls. The snow fell almost sideways and visibility was minimal. The road leading to our house was practically invisible, covered by a thick layer of snow. We had eaten dinner early and were in the living room with the lights low, trying to hear the television over the sound of the wind. It was one of those nights when you feel like the outside world has simply stopped. That's when we saw movement in the yard. At first I thought it was just the shadow of a tree swaying, but my wife noticed it too and pointed toward the window. In the middle of the snow, lit only by the yellowish porch light, there was a boy standing there. He looked like a teenager, far too thin for how cold it was, wearing a light jacket and no hat. He was visibly shivering, his arms pressed close to his body. Even from inside the house, you could tell he wasn't moving much, just standing there, staring at the door. It made no sense at all because there's no sidewalk, no bus stop, nothing near our house. I opened the door slightly, just enough to speak to him without stepping outside. The wind rushed in hard, bringing snow and a cold that cut into my face immediately. I asked what he was doing there, if he was lost. His voice came out low and broken, almost lost in the wind. He said he needed to use a phone, that his cell phone had died, and that he had been walking for hours. While he spoke, I tried to see his face better, but the light didn't quite reach him. When I took a step forward, opening the door wider, he immediately backed away as if the light itself had pushed him back. He didn't run, didn't turn around. He just took a few slow steps into the darkness until he was almost invisible in the snow. I stood there with the door open for a few seconds, waiting for him to say something else or come closer again. Nothing happened. The wind and snow swallowed any sound. My wife grabbed my arm and asked me to close the door. She was pale and shaking, not just from the cold. I locked the door and the two of us stood there looking at each other, trying to understand what had just happened. The feeling was strange, as if something had been interrupted halfway through. We stayed silent for a few minutes, just listening to the storm outside, waiting to see the boy appear again at the window or knock on the door. After a while, I decided to look out the front window again. The snow was falling harder and the porch light cast confusing shadows across the yard. I didn't see the boy anywhere. That didn't reassure me. On the contrary, I had the feeling that he was far too close to have simply vanished so quickly. My wife said he didn't seem like he was really asking for help, that the way he backed away was strange, almost rehearsed. I tried to disagree, saying he might have just been scared, but even I didn't fully believe that. If someone is freezing in the middle of a snowstorm, they don't move away from the only house with lights on. A few minutes later, something caught my attention. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it on the ground near the porch. The footprints started there, clearly defined in the fresh snow. They were sneaker prints too small for an adult. I followed them with the light, walking slowly, feeling the wind hit my face. The footprints didn't lead away from the house. They went around it, circling the yard, passing by the windows, the back, the side. In some spots they stopped, as if someone had stood there for a few seconds. What didn't make sense was that there was no trail leading away, no footprints going toward the road or into the woods, just prints surrounding the entire house. I went back inside with a tightness in my chest that wouldn't go away. My wife saw my expression and immediately knew something was wrong. I told her what I'd seen, and the two of us stood in silence for a few seconds, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe he had run off and the snow had covered the exit tracks. Maybe someone was playing a cruel joke. But none of those ideas held up when we remembered how clear the footprints were around the house. It wasn't a hurried path. It looked like someone walking slowly, observing. The snowstorm continued heavily, and the wind made the house creak now and then. We turned off some of the lights and stayed with just the living room lights on, sitting on the couch without really watching the television. With every stronger gust, I thought I heard footsteps outside, but when I focused, it was just the wind dragging the snow. Even so, neither of us suggested going to bed. It felt like if we lay down, something could happen without us noticing. We kept looking at the windows, waiting to see a shadow, a movement, anything. At one point, I heard a dry sound coming from the side of the house, like something brushing against the wall and sliding slowly. It wasn't a hard knock, more like an accidental touch, but it was enough to make us both stand up at the same time. I went to the side window carefully and pulled the curtain back just a little. The light barely reached anything beyond the snow swirling in the wind. I didn't see anyone, but I had the clear impression that someone had just moved away from there. My wife whispered my name behind me, asking me to come back. I closed the curtain and locked the window, even though it was already locked. We waited a few more minutes, and I decided to step out quickly onto the porch, just to confirm the footprints before the snow covered everything. I opened the door with the flashlight on, and the wind nearly tore it from my hand. The prints were still there, now softer at the edges but still visible. What caught my attention was that some of the footprints overlapped, as if the boy had made more than one lap around the house. There was no sign of haste or stumbling. I went back inside with my face burning from the cold and locked the door again, feeling certain that this hadn't been a simple request for help. After that, no one else appeared. The snowstorm stayed heavy for hours and the tracks were gradually covered. Even so, we didn't sleep. We took turns watching the windows, checking the doors, listening for any different sound in the wind. The house felt smaller that night, as if the space had shrunk. I felt physically exhausted, but my mind wouldn't shut off. My wife kept her phone in her hand, even knowing the signal there was weak. It was more an automatic gesture than anything useful. When it started to get light, the wind eased a bit. We went outside together, carefully looking around the entire house. The snow was deeper now, but you could still see remnants of the footprints near the walls, now distorted. Again, there was no exit trail. Nothing going toward the road, nothing into the woods. Just scattered marks around the house, as if someone had walked around and then simply ceased to exist there. That didn't fit with someone exhausted, lost, or suffering from extreme cold. That was what bothered us the most. Later that day, we called the local sheriff and explained the situation as directly as possible. He showed up in the early afternoon, looked around, asked a few questions, and said it was probably some local kid looking for help, and that the snow could have erased the exit tracks. I didn't argue. There was no way to prove anything at that point. He left us with that frustrating feeling that something had happened, just not in the right way to become an official problem. We never saw the boy again. No one ever came looking for him, and there was never any news of someone missing that night. We continued living there for a while, but that experience changed the way we saw the house. Every time it snows heavily, I remember the way he backed into the darkness when I opened the door. I remember the footprints that didn't lead away. I don't know what he wanted, or why he appeared there. I only know that that night, someone was very close to our house, calmly observing us, and left without leaving a clear path. Story 6. I was traveling alone through Arizona for work, and ended up stopping at that motel more out of exhaustion than choice. It was one of those very simple places by the highway, with ground-level rooms and exterior corridors. It was already past midnight when I arrived. The place looked almost empty, with only a few lights on and a strange silence for someone who had been driving for hours. The reception worked through a small window, and the owner looked sleepy but polite. I took the key, parked in front of the room, and went inside quickly because the air was cold for that region. The room was basic, with a strong smell of cleaning product and the constant hum of an old air conditioner. I took a quick shower, plugged my phone into charge, and lay down without even turning on the TV. I was exhausted. At some point during the night, I woke up to a sound that didn't make sense right away. It was low and irregular, like someone breathing with difficulty. It took me a few seconds to realize it was coming from outside the door. I stayed completely still in bed, trying to listen more closely. When I moved my arm, the sound stopped immediately. I froze, waiting. A few seconds later, the breathing returned, closer to the door, too heavy to be wind or plumbing. My heart started racing, and I was certain there was someone standing in the corridor right in front of my room. I stayed lying there without moving, trying to control my breathing so I wouldn't make any noise. Every time I shifted even slightly, even just adjusting my head on the pillow, the sound outside stopped instantly. This wasn't someone walking through the corridor. It was someone standing there paying attention to my movements. The corridor had that smell of warm dust and old cigarette smoke that seeps in under the door, which made everything feel even more real. I thought about calling the front desk, but the phone was on the small table near the door, and the idea of getting up filled me with immediate panic. After a few minutes, I worked up the courage to sit up slowly in bed. The sound stopped again. I waited, counting in my head, trying not to think of the worst. The breathing returned, lower now as if the person had stepped back slightly but was still there. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it at the gap under the door. I didn't see the shadow of any feet, just the light reflecting off the concrete floor of the corridor. Even so, the feeling was far too clear to ignore. Someone was out there standing still, listening. I stayed in that position for a time that felt far too long, not knowing what to do. I thought about screaming or banging on the door, but something told me that drawing attention at that moment was not a good idea. The breathing kept coming and going, sometimes stronger, sometimes almost imperceptible. At one point, I heard a faint dragging sound, as if someone were adjusting their body against the wall. My stomach twisted. This wasn't someone passing by or lost in the wrong corridor. It was someone who had stopped there on purpose. On impulse, I jumped up and turned on the room light. At that exact moment, the sound outside stopped completely. I went to the door and looked through the peephole. The corridor was empty, lit by a weak white light that made everything look even more deserted. I didn't see anyone, but I clearly felt like I had just lost sight of someone by seconds. I stepped away from the door and leaned my back against it, trying to figure out if I was overreacting. That's when I heard footsteps moving away, slow, heading toward another wing of the motel. Human footsteps, unhurried. I waited a few minutes before doing anything else, my hand still on the doorknob, feeling the cold metal. When I was sure the footsteps had stopped, I picked up the room phone and called the front desk. I explained quietly that someone had been standing outside my door minutes earlier. The owner sounded confused and said there were hardly any guests that night and that no one should have been walking around that wing. Still, he said he would take a look. I sat on the bed, fully dressed with the light on, listening in the distance to a door opening and closing and footsteps I couldn't tell were his or not. Sometime later, I heard a light knock on my door. I looked through the peephole before responding. It was the motel owner alone. I opened the door just a little, keeping the chain on, and he said he hadn't seen anyone in the corridor. He commented that that wing was usually empty during the week and suggested that maybe I had heard an air conditioner from a nearby room. I knew it wasn't that, but I didn't argue. I asked if anyone else was staying in that wing, and he replied that there wasn't. After he left, I locked everything again and couldn't sleep anymore. The rest of the night dragged on. I sat on the bed, leaning against the wall farthest from the door, with my backpack packed in case I needed to leave quickly. Any noise outside made my body react instantly. Twice I thought I heard very light footsteps in the corridor, but I didn't hear the breathing again. That almost made me more nervous because it meant whoever it was had left knowing exactly when to stop. I didn't really sleep. I just dozed in short bursts, waking up startled each time. When it started to get light, I finally worked up the courage to open the door and carefully look down the corridor. It was empty, as if nothing had happened. The concrete floor had old dirt marks, but nothing recent. I went to the front desk to check out early. While I was waiting, I saw a man sitting on a bench near the ice machine on the other side of the courtyard. He seemed to be watching me in a discreet way, looking away whenever I met his gaze. Something about him felt familiar, but I couldn't place why. My stomach turned instantly. When I reached the counter, I asked again about the guests in that wing. The owner confirmed that no one else had been staying there that night. I mentioned the noises and asked if the corridor cameras worked. He frowned and said the camera for that wing had been down all night, something that sometimes happened. The casual way he said it bothered me. Before leaving, I discreetly pointed to the man outside and asked if he was a guest. The owner looked surprised and said the man was staying in another wing and that he didn't know he had been walking around over there. I left the motel with a heavy feeling in my chest. While I was loading my things into the car, I saw the man pass behind me without saying anything, getting into a vehicle parked farther away. He didn't look directly at me, but he knew I had noticed him. I drove away without looking back. To this day, what bothers me most isn't the sound of breathing at the door. It's knowing that someone was there watching from a place they shouldn't have been, without the owner's knowledge, and that the only thing separating me from that person was a thin motel door and the chance that I woke up, hours later, already back on the road. I tried to rationalize everything that had happened. I thought about how that man had been able to move through an empty wing without anyone noticing, about how the camera in that exact area had been down all night. None of it seemed like a coincidence, but there was nothing concrete enough to report. I kept driving, but I checked the rearview mirrors more than usual with the persistent feeling that that night hadn't really ended when I left the motel. Since then, I've never stayed in an exterior corridor motel while traveling alone. I always ask for rooms near the reception, always check if there's movement nearby, and any sound outside the door puts me on alert. That night in rural Arizona taught me that the most intense fear doesn't always come from something you clearly see, but from the silent certainty that someone was there, far too close, breathing on the other side, waiting for you to move. Story 7. I was living alone in a semi-detached house in the interior of New Jersey at the time. I had just moved after a long breakup and decided to spend New Year's at home, without any party, just watching TV and trying to go to bed early. The street was residential and quiet, with houses very close to each other, separated only by small gardens and low fences. After midnight, the neighborhood became completely silent. No sound of fireworks, no cars passing by. I turned off the TV, switched off most of the lights, and went to the bedroom, still dressed because it was very cold, and the house took a long time to warm up. I was already lying down when I heard a knock on the front door. It wasn't loud, but it was far too clear to be a mistake. 3 slow knocks, spaced out, like someone who wasn't in a hurry. I looked at the clock on my phone and saw that it was just after 12:15. My first thought was that a neighbor had gotten the wrong house or needed something urgent. Even so, I didn't get up right away. I sat on the bed, listening, waiting for another knock or a voice. A few seconds later, I heard a man speaking from outside, saying he lived nearby and needed help. The voice was low, controlled, and very close to the door. I got up slowly and went to the living room window next to the door without making any noise. I pulled the curtain aside just enough to look outside. The streetlight illuminated part of the sidewalk, but the person was standing too close to the door for me to see his face. All I could make out was a dark figure, standing very close, almost pressed against it. That made me uncomfortable, because there was no space between him and the door, not how someone would normally stand while waiting. He spoke again, saying his car had broken down and that he needed to use a phone. The way he spoke sounded rehearsed, without urgency, as if he were reciting something he had already memorized. I answered from inside the house that I couldn't open the door, but that I could call the police or roadside assistance if he wanted. There was a pause that was too short after that. He didn't thank me, didn't respond right away. When he spoke again, his voice was a little more tense, saying he didn't need the police, just quick help. I felt a chill in my stomach. I repeated that I wouldn't open the door and that I was already calling someone. I stood there with my phone in my hand, expecting to hear footsteps moving away. Instead, I heard him moving to the side of the house, slowly circling around. I heard footsteps passing along the side of the house, very close to the wall. The wooden floor creaked slightly when he stepped on some uneven part of the exterior ground. I stood in the middle of the living room, trying to decide whether I should hide in the bedroom or stay where I was so I could hear better. The silence of the street made everything sharper. Within seconds, I heard a low sound coming from the front window, like fingers touching the glass. Not knocking, just testing. My whole body went on alert. I turned off the living room light and stepped away from the window, feeling my heart pound so hard it seemed to echo in my chest. He kept walking along the side of the house, and then I heard the clear sound of a handle being moved on the hallway window. It wasn't a hard pull. It was careful, slow, like someone checking whether it was unlocked. I realized then that he wasn't trying to force his way in. He was looking for an opening. I stayed completely still, holding my phone with both hands, trying to breathe without making a sound. I thought about calling the police at that moment, but I was afraid my voice would reveal exactly where I was inside the house. After a few minutes, I heard footsteps on the other side of the shared wall, near the small yard that separated my house from the neighbors. The sound was controlled, unhurried, like someone who knew the space and was testing boundaries. Then I heard the same low sound of glass being touched again, this time at the back window. It was always the same pattern: approach, stop, test, move on. No talking, no new requests. That was when I became certain that the conversation at the door had only been a pretext. If he really needed help, he would have accepted it when I offered to call someone. That's when I noticed something different on the street. A light turned on in the house next door, on the other side of the shared wall. Soon after, another light came on a little farther down. The man stopped moving for a few seconds, as if he were listening too. I stood there, barely breathing, waiting for the next sound. When I heard footsteps moving away from the house, I felt immediate relief, but I didn't move. I waited a while longer, listening as the silence slowly returned. I waited several minutes before moving, even after I heard nothing else outside. The neighboring house's lights were still on, and that seemed to be the only thing that had really changed the situation. I went to the window carefully and peeked out at the street again. There was no one on the sidewalk, no shadows moving away, no cars running. The silence returned to what it had been before, but now it felt artificial, as if it had been forced. I locked the door with the key, even though it was already locked, and checked every window one by one, touching the handles to be sure. I went back to the bedroom and sat on the bed, unable to lie down. My body was still tense, as if expecting to hear another sound at any moment. I kept thinking about how he knew I was alone, about how he chose to knock just after midnight, when everything was too quiet. I also thought about how close he had stood to the door, too close for someone who just needed help. None of it felt improvised. It was as if he had counted on the possibility that I would open the door, but had an alternate plan in case I didn't. I stayed awake the entire night, sitting in the bedroom with my phone charging and the bedside lamp on. Every creak of the house made me look at the door. At times I thought I heard footsteps on the sidewalk, but when I really listened, there was nothing. The street was far too quiet, as if everyone had decided to sleep at the same time. I tried to convince myself that he was gone for good, but the way he left, only after the lights came on, kept me from relaxing. It felt like he knew exactly when it was no longer worth staying. When it started to get light, I went to the kitchen and made coffee just to have something warm in my hands. I looked out the back window and saw the empty yard, with no clear marks on the hard winter ground. Even so, the sense of invasion remained. There had been no break-in, no confrontation, nothing I could point to as proof. And yet someone had moved around my house, tested windows, evaluated possibilities, all while I was inside, hearing every step. That was what affected me the most. The next morning, I spoke briefly with a neighbor when she went out to get the newspaper. I mentioned that someone had knocked on my door during the night, trying to sound casual. She said she had also woken up to a noise and turned on the light but hadn't seen anyone. That confirmed what I already suspected. The lights were the reason he left. It wasn't fear, it was calculation. I went back inside with a knot in my stomach, realizing that if I had opened the door or if the neighbors hadn't woken up, the night could have ended very differently. After that, I spent the entire day with the feeling of being behind something, as if I had narrowly escaped. I locked everything, left some lights on even during the day, and avoided going out. I kept replaying the sound of the knocks, the controlled voice asking for help, and the way he moved around the house after hearing no. Nothing was explicit, nothing was direct. But on that New Year's night in New Jersey, I learned that some people don't knock on doors expecting an answer. They knock to measure time, reaction, and how alone you are.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.